Well, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, welcome to Motivo's panel discussion on racial trauma in America. My name is Rachel McCrickard. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm also the CEO and founder of Motivo. And we are just so thrilled that you've decided to tune into this discussion today. We were truly overwhelmed with the interest in this conversation. We had just over 4,000 people register for today's event. Which in my mind really clearly points to the desire among mental health professionals to have a deeper, richer conversation about this topic. And that's exactly what we aim to do today. I want to thank also everyone who included a question in your registration form. We utilized those questions to shape the content of the conversation today. But we are going to leave the last 10 minutes or so for you to ask any additional questions that didn't get covered. So feel free to use the chat box to be able to prompt a question our way, and I'll take a look at it and present it to the panelists. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists and kick off today's event, but before I do, let me just go over a quick couple of things. One, we are recording today's panel discussion. Everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording. You're welcome to share it with others who weren't able to be in attendance today. Also, because of the volume of registrations and questions that we received, we decided to extend the panel to 1:30 p.m. today. That's Eastern Standard Time. So it was originally scheduled for an hour. It's going to go for an hour and a half. If you need to drop off early, no problem. But for those who want to stick around for the full conversation, we welcome you to do so. Also, I'll be listening to and compiling all of the resources and tools that the panelists mentioned today, and I'll send those to you in a follow-up email, so look for those links if you want to check out their recommendations. And then lastly, we've heard from many of you that you'd like to have a safe place for continued dialogue around the issue of racial trauma and maybe other topics that are important to mental health professionals. So also in our follow-up email, we'll be sending a link to an interest form for those who'd like to hear more about virtual peer consultation groups open to all mental health professionals, students, pre-licensed, licensed, clinical supervisors, and counselor educators as well. For those of you who are new to Motivo, let me just quickly say that Motivo is an online clinical supervision community. We help therapists, mental health agencies, and universities deliver clinical supervision online. We have a robust directory of nearly 1,000 clinical supervisors across the country and some international available for online clinical supervision or for post-licensure peer consultation. Actually, our 4 panelists today are all clinical supervisors that you'll find on Motivo. And at this point, I'm excited to introduce them to you and to dive into today's discussion. So first, Dr. Mukunda Akunyili. Dr. Akunyili is at LMFT. He's a clinical supervisor, and he's an associate professor of Africana Studies at Georgia State University. He is an author and has been a human rights, social justice organizer and activist for the last 40 years. Dr. Harrison Davis. Dr. Davis is a licensed professional counselor with a private practice in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also an associate professor of counseling at the University of North Georgia. With over 20 years of clinical experience, Dr. Davis offers specialized skills in facilitating growth and change. So welcome, Dr. Davis. Dr. Carla Smith. Dr. Smith is a licensed professional counselor in Georgia, and she's a licensed mental health counselor in Florida. She also provides clinical supervision. Dr. Smith has over 10 years of experience in the counseling field and is an advocate of social justice. And then Dr. Carla Smith. Dr. Smith is a clinical social worker, a marriage and family therapist, a professor, and a clinical supervisor. And over the last 15 years, Dr. Smith has developed expertise in diversity, inclusion, and culturally responsive mental health treatment. Dr. Smith believes that change occurs when we agree to engage in consistent, difficult dialogue. Dr. Davis is going to be facilitating today's discussion, so I'm going to turn it over to him to get things started. Dr. Davis, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Rachel. I want to thank you and Motivo for taking a brave stance and trying to help all of us deal with the current situation, trying to help us to provide some resources or even simply an outlet for all of our clinicians out there and their supervisees and some of their students. So we have a lot to get through. Thank you for the wonderful introductions. And to all the participants who are here, you guys sent us a number of questions, and we've lumped some of the questions into categories, and we're going to try to get through all of them, or the bulk of them, through the next hour and a half, but we may not be able to get through everything. So I just want to start off by asking our panelists a question about them and the events that we've all experienced or observed or even heard about over the last week. If I could just quickly hear from the panelists, describe what it has been like for you over the last week after George Floyd's death and the protests that followed. Let's start with you, Dr. Smith.
Thanks so much, Dr. Davis. So this is a really great question. I think that it's hard for me to put it into words, but I'll do my best. As a Black mother, as a wife to a Black man, as a Black woman myself, and Black therapist working with Black clinicians, I am acutely aware of the stress that racism continues to cause, but in the last week, on the heels and in the midst of significant stress because of the coronavirus, bearing witness to the senseless murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and countless others throughout the last couple of weeks and months, has at times been unbearable. It's been really difficult to not only acknowledge what's going on for me, but to also sit and hear the trauma, the sadness, and the pain of those of us that are watching and that feel a connection, and fear that we might be next. And so yeah, it's been challenging. It's been a struggle.
Gotcha.
Daily.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Sapp, what has the last week been like for you?
Well, I definitely echo the sentiments of Dr. Smith. I think it has definitely been so not just hard with George Floyd, but I am from the Georgia area off of the coast, near where Ahmaud Arbery, 2 counties over from where he resided, where he was killed. And so that somewhat compounded everything else for me. I know we're talking about our supervisees and working with them. And I have a supervisee who was the cousin. And so that just added even more layers to what I was experiencing as a supervisee, as a mother of, a son, as the sister of her brothers and the daughter of so it's been a lot. It's been hard. But at the same time, I found myself, I think, more empowered now than I've ever been, realizing that the change has to start, and that change starts with me, and what I do.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sapp. We were having some audio challenges right there, but we're going to get through today's meeting. If you can make sure that you're as close to your Wi-Fi system as possible, that would be very helpful. And finally, we have Dr. Akunyili. If you can tell us, what has it been like for you over the past week?
This week has been hectic on lots of different levels. I decided, well, actually, it's been kind of a ramp up. I live in Georgia, and it started even before this week with the murder, lynching of Ahmaud Arbery, a young brother here in South Georgia. And so there was a lot of tension building up already. I'm a part of a pretty large, supportive, activist community. And so while, for instance, and one of the things we said is that we're caught in this two-edged crisis. There's COVID-19, which is very real. There's also the need to fight against very real police terror. And so people were going down to march down in South Georgia. And then, of course, this week comes and becomes even more so. I've learned quite a bit ago that if I've seen the first few minutes of one of those videos, that's all I need to see. And I don't need to see any more like that. but of course they keep popping up on your timeline, right? And and sometimes we get addicted just to watching over and over again. So I've had to avoid that for myself, because it's not something that you need to feed yourself on. And then what I found is it's really important for me to raise that question in all my therapy sessions. Hey, what's going on for you? How you doing? Right? Which has, yeah, I know you're here for couples therapy, but how's your life going with all this action going on for you? I think it's important to put all those things on the front burner with folks, both for my clients, also for my supervisors, and also for myself. We'll talk about this a little bit later, I'm sure, but I find that for me, it's important to surround yourself with an intentional community that you can talk about these things.
Yeah, that would be great. A supportive, intentional community as well. I can just add to that, you know, the last couple of weeks, it grew more intense for me as it started off just thinking about Ahmaud Arbery in South Georgia. I also live in Atlanta, and so that was very real to us. And then also there was the incident of the black man in New York City park asking a woman to leash her dog, and the phone call she made to the police officer. Thank God he videotaped it, but it just makes me wonder what could have happened if the police showed up, believed her story, which was a false narrative. And then there was the incident with George Floyd, and I made myself watch the video. And then I believe there's a woman in Kentucky that was also the victim of some police brutality and violence. And so all of that just built up for me day by day, like you mentioned, Dr. Akunyili, about everything's showing up on our timeline. And it had an impact on me. I felt conflicted at times, where I felt a little bit scared and frightened, concerned. And then other days I felt motivated and wanted to go out there and do something. So I had to take care of myself in order for me to take care of my clients and my supervisees, who all wanted to talk about these incidents. So one of the big topics that has come up happens to be around the whole issue about racial trauma, race-based. And many of us are watching these videos. We're engaging in conversations with our friends and colleagues. We're watching news. You can just turn on the television and you see some horrific images on television, and that tends to leave an impact on some of us. And so we can just start off today's discussion, making sure we have a clear understanding about the concept of race-based stress or racial trauma, and what does that mean like? So Dr. Sapp, can you start us off with that and helping us to understand that concept?
So thank you, Dr. Davis, and I definitely would like to start off. I noticed one of the questions asked the difference between collective trauma and racial trauma, and that's something I think is very important. When we think about the trauma associated with these consistent just overflow of it in our news feeds and our Facebook feeds, all of our social media, it typically is that exclusive discrimination, brutality, police brutality of that nature that has taken place against one particular race. And this particular race is the African American community. When you've seen over in the collective stress that is experienced as a result of it, I'm safe, and so I'm finding myself in that constant state of fight or fight, in that constant state of, just kind of discontent, tends to play a big part in the racial trauma that we're experiencing, versus more of a collective trauma where it doesn't necessarily, or cultural trauma where it doesn't necessarily have to do with just one particular race, but more so just a group of individuals who identify with one another. I think another thing to kind of add to that with this racial trauma is just kind of the generational aspect of the trauma that's been experienced throughout the years with African Americans, from slavery to civil rights movement up until now with police brutality and things of that nature. And that has taken an impact upon us all.
Thank you. And Dr. Akunyili, if you can tell us a little bit more, what I'm hearing is that part of racial trauma includes being horrified about the intensity of some of the brutality and treatment against certain individuals out there based on race and ethnicity. Can you help us to further understand this concept of racial trauma? And your microphone is on mute.
Thank you for the quick eye. I think, I know that's the popular term that's used. I don't necessarily always use that idea of racial trauma,
Okay.
but but that doesn't mean I think we can still fit into this conversation. I believe that the reality of Black people and other people of color in this country is that because of white supremacy, and I think it's important to name the elephant, right? Because of the idea that we don't really belong here, or that whites belong here more than us. There's this experience of low intensity warfare, right? And low intensity warfare means, no, there's not a bomb blowing off every day, but there's something traumatic happening on a regular basis, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional, whether it's a mental occurrence. As you mentioned, the brother Cooper in Central Park, right?
Yes.
That's low intensity warfare, right? Walking down the street and someone wants to know, well, why are you here, right? A delivery person trying to deliver a package and someone demanding to know, well, let me see your ID, right? I teach a class right now. I just finished it up, Race, Class, and Gender in Contemporary South Africa. I was supposed to be in South Africa right now with my class, but COVID-19 shut us down, right? But I had a South African friend of mine on Zoom to teach my class yesterday, who was talking about the experience of being asked for a pass by any white person that sees you coming. That's low intensity warfare. It's constantly the idea that you are not supposed to be here. And finally, I think for me, the best way to talk about what people are calling racial trauma is just that feeling, like Fannie Lou Hamer said, of being sick and tired of being sick and tired. Here's another thing coming up, and always being hyper vigilant for the next thing. That's the kind of trauma that people feel, I think.
Yeah, I hear you. So part of your definition of it, sometimes we are forced or asked to justify our existence. You know, we're asked to justify our reasons for being where we are, as if we don't belong there. And that can cause anxiety for some people. Dr. Smith, what do you say about that in racial trauma?
Yeah, I think Dr. Sapp and Dr. Akunyili have given a really great foundation of the definition of the term and the contextual experiences. I'd add that I'd add a highlight to the symptomology of racial trauma, and that we're talking about physical, psychological, emotional symptoms that are felt on a daily basis that have to be, suppressed in order to move in certain spaces in our professional lives. And so this suppression continues to bubble under the surface. And so, again, physiological as well as psychological and emotional symptoms can multiply. And this is something that occurs by bearing witness. It can be secondary trauma, and it can also be something that we experience that we are in solidarity with those families and with those individuals that are impacted. And then we are reminded of our own experiences of racism and the trauma that exist and intergenerationally and will and for our children and grandchildren.
Gotcha. So what do you believe about the whole concept about the most recent events about race in our country? It sort of brought reality into the eyes of a lot of our citizens here, and those who are in denial about racism has been really an awakening sense that they're experiencing. And some of those individuals are African Americans, some of them are Hispanic Americans, some of them are Asian Americans. Would you say that is also contributing to some of the stress that these are experiencing?
Absolutely. I think that, the denial is part of the trauma. And so, while it's a double-edged, and it's good and it's bad that we are having these conversations now. It's, we needed them. We need these conversations. We need to be a part of them. However, it's the microaggressions, the gaslighting, the parts of the daily experiences of people of color who are acutely aware and have been for their entire lives. Some of us have had to, our parents have had to have conversations with us 4, 5, 6 years of age. And so these are things that many of us are acutely aware of. And so that denial, it's hard. It's hard to face right now in, 6 months into 2020 that we're saying that we're just now, that some people are just now becoming aware of the
And so Dr. Sapp, do you also believe in that notion that some of these individuals, including Black Americans, were simply in denial about the total existence of racism, despite being told by members of their family or even learning it through the media? Do you believe that they're the ones who were least prepared for the most recent incidents?
I would say they were. And I say that because for some of them, they've never experienced it personally.
Yeah.
And so because they hadn't experienced it personally, it wasn't as real. It's kind of one of those things where it happens everywhere else, but it doesn't happen in my backyard. I can speak to, just with the Ahmaud Arbery case, for a lot of people who live in coastal Georgia, we work, we play together, we do everything together, and then this happens in your backyard, and it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't happen here. And so I think that plays a significant part in it when you don't have the experience, when you haven't had the experience. And so I don't know if it's necessarily denial. It's just one of those things where, hey, it doesn't happen to me, so it's not such an issue for me. But then to watch the murder of George Floyd, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And I think that's where, for a lot of people, the reality set in that this is not right. I told someone the other day, we're watching humanity at this point. That's what we're literally seeing is humanity.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And Dr. Akunyili, sorry about that. There's a quote floating around social media. I don't know who began the quote that indicates racism is not new. It's simply being filmed. So a lot of us it's more than just hearing about it. It's more than just hearing a rumor about something that happened somewhere in South Georgia or New York City Park or in the Minneapolis streets. There is footage of it. There is credible video footage of it. What are your thoughts about evidence being so readily available for anyone to pull up, that we can actually watch a man die over our phone or computer? What do you think about that?
I think that quote is accurate. These are not new things. It's not that these conditions have started. Also, one of the things that people do on social media, for instance, particularly amongst our folk, is you might see, they'll put up a picture of some people from 60 years ago wearing a suit. Maybe it's Sunday, right? And they'll say, when we dress like this, we didn't get treated so bad. Then they'll put up a picture of some young guys with some sagging jeans on, right? As if the way you dress has an impact on whether or not you get impacted by racist violence.
Really?
And the reality is that in the 1920s and the early 1900s, Ida B. Wells had a whole campaign against lynching, right? The NAACP had a campaign against lynching because they said at least every day one Black man was being lynched somewhere inside the United States, right? Extrajudicial killing. The organization that I'm a part of, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, in 2013 published a study called Operation Ghetto Storm, where we identified that every 28 hours, a Black man, woman, or child is killed extrajudiciously. In other words, outside of judicial support, the law, by a police officer, a vigilante like Arbery, or a rental cop, right? Every 28 hours, somebody gets killed. And that has gone down to probably less than every 24 hours, a Black man, woman, child is killed extrajudiciously, right? Then, of course, somebody will say, well, what about all the Black people that kill Black people? Most assuredly, if those people are killed by other Black people, the police hunt them down, arrest them, and put them in jail, put them on trial. Extrajudicial means people get killed and nothing gets done about it.
I'm happy that we have this video footage of some of these atrocities for legal purposes. Do you believe it is healthy for us to have those images so readily available to us?
No. That's a part of the trauma, right?
But yeah, so that can adds to it.
It's a double-edged sword. It's important that we have it, right? We live in an observation society now, so we can't escape being seen by somebody somewhere. That's a good thing. At the same time, right, I think that we should encourage people to regulate what you choose to watch, right? Just because you know some evidence is there doesn't mean that you have to inundate yourself with that evidence all the time. You know, I'm probably the oldest person on this screen right now, right? You know, I was, born in the 50s. I was actually born in Mississippi under Jim Crow. I grew up in California. You know, I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of things happen. You know, my first experience into activism was the Watts Uprising in 1965, right? So I've seen a lot of rebellions like this. But at the same time, I don't need to watch over and over and over again my people dying on camera. That's traumatic,
yes, it is.
right? And so it's necessary, but at the same time, I think for us as individuals and for us who are working with other people, right, we have to teach people to regulate how much trauma you allow to come inside. I don't need to see George die over and over again to believe that it really happened.
Yeah. So Dr. Smith, we're now hearing, the trauma can come from different angles. We can hear about it. We can hear about it on news. We can experience it, but we can also see it play over and over and over again. And all of that is contributing to what you talked about earlier about racial trauma, which sounds a lot like PTSD. If you can help us expand on that just a little bit more so we can truly understand some of the symptoms that are associated with traumatic stress and racial trauma.
Thanks, Dr. Davis. Absolutely. Well, I just want to add, though, that also in addition to watching the videos, the last moments of a person's life in a way that is not how I would guess they want to be seen, and something that they want shown. I can't believe that that's something that they or their families want to be seen. I also think that it reduces them to their murder versus showing that they are parents and children and all these other things in their lives, their humanity is lost. So I will add, so the experiences and the symptoms of racial trauma, I've been seeing a lot, and and naming them is important. So consistent fear, hypervigilance, headaches, insomnia, body aches. We may take inventory of what's going on with our body and realize that we might have been clenching our fists. We may have been not breathing as deeply as normal, and how that impacts our bodies are that we begin to ache and feel pain. Memory difficulty, as well as self-blame and confusion. Lethargy and guilt, things that we can't usually in the moment find the root, but that may be a blanket on every experience that we have. The difficulty of not having a moment of rest from seeing these images and experiencing the trauma is that we're consistently having a trauma response, and so this is our daily lived experiences of trauma and of symptoms related to what we are.
Absolutely. And Dr. Sapp, I'm also hearing from some of my clients and even friends and relatives about they are just angry. You know, they're frustrated and they're irritable. And I'm seeing videos on social media. Sorry, I'm stuck on social media. People out there yelling at the police officers in their face. I could see the rage in their face. What role does that play in racial trauma or PTSD, Dr. Sapp?
So you have that part, I think, as Dr. Smith was saying, with the hypervigilance, but then you also have that hyperarousal, and you find that there's that lack of trust. And the way that, for most people, how do I express myself, because I don't really know how to express myself right now, is that I act out through rage. I'm screaming, I'm yelling, I'm all these different things, because we don't, it's that lack of emotional, I want to say intelligence, but just kind of a lack of just the ability to deal with emotions and express it that is more, that isn't more rage. Part of, you see that piece.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sapp. You were breaking up just a little bit at the end.
Okay.
Dr. Akunyili, I'm also seeing in some of my clients and talking to friends, they feel bewildered. They're like, I don't know what to do. They seem sort of lost, like things are out of control around them, although they didn't experience the personal trauma themselves physically or anything. It's really impacting them, as many of them have begun to isolate themselves. Even in the middle of a pandemic, they're doing it even more. Can you tell us a little bit more about those symptoms with it?
Yeah, I think it's been called vicarious trauma, right?
Yes.
And where it's like it didn't happen to you yourself, but because you're witnessing it, you internalize it. And I think particularly when you're talking about Black folk, right? I believe, for instance, in terms of the sense of identity that we have, we relate communally, right? So for the good and the bad, right? We tend to see somebody Black on television and they're being successful and we feel proud. Why? Hey, they're representing us, right? At the same time, we hear something happens on television and maybe there was a huge murder or crime. We say, oh my God, I hope it wasn't somebody Black. Why? Because we associate, we say, if it happens to them, it's going to reflect back on us. The same thing happens with that communal sense of identity, with how we see this trauma. Even though it's not happening to us, it is happening to us. And again, rather than isolating and hiding out, I believe that the solution for good mental health is to reconnect to community as much as possible. Even with this shelter in place that we've had, one of the greatest things I think ever. Now, I'm not a big music person. I listen to music, but I'm not a big music person. My wife is a huge music person, and she's been enjoying to death all these versus competitions on Instagram, right? Where thousands of people are coming together and they're playing and they're dancing. It's like being able to have a party. I think that's one of the most healthy things that we've had during this crisis period. It allows, while people are listening to music and talking, they're communicating on Instagram. It's not like being face-to-face at a real gathering, but it's keeping people connected. Those are healthy things, right? It's healthy to be in relationship. And so when we see people isolating, shutting themselves off because of this trauma, whether it's vicarious or real trauma, right? Our work should be to help people find strings of connections back to community.
I agree completely. So we've talked about some of the symptoms of racial trauma, race-based stress, or I can even put it under the umbrella of PTSD, whether you experience the physical trauma or not. And I wanted us to talk about that to help our attendees who are all mostly mental health clinicians, supervisors, professors, and students of counseling, that we can at least recognize some of those symptoms and try to gain some understanding about where it comes from, because it looks different for everybody that's out there. But now I want to transition just a little bit to talk about how can our clinicians help their clients? How can they help their supervisees who are seeing clients who are experiencing some of these symptoms, and the supervisees themselves are going through it? I was just talking to one of my supervisees yesterday, and in the middle of the session, he just started crying and talking about how heavy all of this has been on him. And he wanted to attend one of the protests, but decided against it. His mom called him. His mom was crying. He had to console his mom. You know, his friends were calling him. His white friends were calling, asking him to explain to them what was going on. And so he just felt so conflicted by it. And I had to take time out to help console, help him to be in a better place, not only for his clients, but for himself. So let's start with you, Dr. Smith. Give us some ideas, some tips on what clinicians can do to help those clients or supervisees who are going through some of these issues with racial trauma.
First, say that my heart is with everyone who's affected, specifically Black Americans and Black people around the world. But I also have a special place in my heart for Black therapists. As one myself, it's difficult to sit with my identities and the at the intersection of immense pride as well as immense heartache at the hands of society and the society that we're in. Most specifically, the one thing that we really need to do for ourselves and that Black clinicians should do for themselves is to acknowledge, spend some time with themselves, to sit with themselves, to be mindful, to journal, to do whatever they need to be acutely aware, to be in their bodies, in their minds, in their emotions, and be acutely aware of how they are affected.
So that awareness
and it's
is important.
Absolutely. The awareness is first and foremost what we need to do. If we don't have the capacity within us, which is also a possibility, we have to seek support. As Dr. Akunyili has mentioned, we absolutely need to connect to communities and using our community and use our resources. One of those being our clinical supervisor. So as a clinical supervisor who is also a Black therapist, I have realized that in this particular moment, it's overwhelming, and I can't set aside what's going on and be completely present. So the first thing is to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that for one another, and to provide whatever space is needed. So to ask for, if a supervisee doesn't have the words, which is understandable, to as a supervisor really be able to create that space and to say, hey, let's just take a step back. As you mentioned, Dr. Davis, I see you. Even through Zoom, I can see your eyes. I'm looking at your eyes. I'm assuming that you're impacted. We make assumptions all the time, and so this is an okay one to make, or at least to be curious about and ask about. And so, to really be seen, it means we have to see ourselves, and that is number one on the list. And so there are other things that we really do need to do. Disconnection, we mentioned. I think also really taking inventory of your connections and seeing where your support is. Sometimes we're not in the space to answer questions. And so to acknowledge that in ourselves means that we can create boundaries, and to say, thank you for reaching out. I don't have the words, and maybe I'll reconnect when I do. But at this moment, I don't.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing from you, some of us, ourselves, our clients, our supervisees, we need to recognize our pain is what I'm hearing from you, and not try to avoid it, not try to stuff it down. And also connections, as you mentioned, with other individuals, a supportive social network group would also be very helpful. Dr. Sapp, what can you add to that about people who are experiencing trauma, and some of them may be experiencing more problems with trying to find meaning with all of this and trying to put it into some type of perspective? You know, now the world doesn't look the way they thought it did. You know, maybe I was wrong about everything, or all those stories I heard from my mom or grandma or grandparents, they were real, and it's still happening now. So they're questioning everything that's going on around them. How can we help some of those individuals?
I think one of the biggest things, and I think Dr. Smith covered it well, is being able to have that support. I think us as clinicians, and us as especially Black clinicians, who have had our own experiences, who've heard of others having their experiences, being able to have that resolve to be able to sit and be able to listen, but then being able to help them work through those things, to not only help them work through it, but helping them find their place in it. You mentioned how do they find meaning, and I think that's a very important concept, because in this, there has to be some meaning that we are able to pull out of this in order to help us become better, help us grow, help us to be able to ensure change. And I think one of the ways they can do that is, one, being able to do their own research, being able to understand the experiences, being able to have the ability to not only allow others to listen at them, but for them to be able to listen at others. I also think Dr. Smith brought up a great point about journaling, because it kind of allows them to be able to work through their own feelings, work through what this means to them. How do they relate? How do they see themselves in all of this, and being able to unpack those different things? So I think doing the personal work, I think, and encouraging them to do that personal work is very, very important, because if they're not willing to do the personal work, and if they're not doing the personal work, then there really isn't any meaning that's going to come from it. So I think encouraging that personal work is really good.
Taking some responsibility for your own growth,
Yes.
even in a challenging time, because if you don't do it, no one else will. So certainly seeking out some help can be very important. And Dr. Akunyili, you also talked about connections with other individuals. Can you expand some more ideas that we can use to help our supervisees and their clients?
I think definitely it's not good to work in isolation. So definitely those things. I think it's important to learn the idea of building intentional communities, finding other people who you can reflect with and reflect off of, right? Again, even if we have to do it virtually like we're doing it now, there's an idea that I teach my supervisees, that I learned from one of my mentors, Dr. Nancy Boyd Franklin, right? The idea of a therapist's use of self. I think it's important for us as therapists to learn to be self-reflective, to question ourselves. Well, what's going on with me right now as I'm having this conversation with my client, right? How am I feeling in my stomach right now as I'm hearing this story or discussing this subject, right? How are my muscles feeling right now? What's happening with my breath? And then to use those messages from the self to give us some direction, even as to how we carry on the conversation, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with, as you're hearing a story and you feel extremely sad or extremely fearful, to say, wow, that really scares me. I wonder what that feels like to you as you're telling it. It didn't even happen to me, right? To use yourself as opposed to being afraid of yourself. I think I come from that second generation of marriage and family therapists trained in the 80s. And a big part of I think that second generation was seeing therapeutic work as art. I know that these days, a lot of what's being taught in therapy is seeing therapy as technique, working as kind of, and so there's this drive to divorce ourselves from ourselves and just rely on the technique, so-called evidence-based technique, right? But I still believe that therapy is in a great part art, and that it involves the whole person. And so a part of that training should be, how do you use yourself as an instrument in the therapy? I think another part is the idea of parallel process, right? Oftentimes our supervisees bring us situations about their relationships with their clients, which actually parallel the process of how the clients are relating to the world. And so I think it becomes important for us to teach our supervisees that idea, to question, if you're having an experience with your client, right? Is it possible with your client reflects the experience that your client is having with their world? And can you bring that conversation into the situation room?
Yes, absolutely.
Sense?
Absolutely. So thank you guys. Some wonderful tips and ideas and strategies and theoretical approaches to help our supervisees, their clients, to sort of deal with some of the trauma, the overwhelming trauma that many individuals are experiencing. I'm also aware that there are individuals who are not experiencing any trauma at all whatsoever. And I'm amazed by how oblivious they can be to some of the realities that are going on out there. And I believe all three of you guys talked about relationships and connections with other individuals. So one of the things that we have to learn, and I'm learning this through my clients and supervisees, assessing some of those relationships and the quality of those relationships, and asking, can I rely on this person for emotional support? Is that a healthy relationship for me to talk about this sensitive topic that means a lot to me? So one of the other questions that we receive from the audience, a lot of them, shift a little bit. How do we communicate about racism to others? How do we talk about white privilege to others when they aren't experiencing things, don't have the same perception of things the way we do? They saw the same video that some of us saw of George Floyd on the ground begging to stop, I can't breathe, and oh my God, yelling out for his mom just before his body went lifeless. And yet there are those individuals, I've seen the social media comments, why can't he breathe? Or what was he doing? That the perception is so different. And so those are the individuals, most of the time, we may have challenges talking to them about racism, or even talking with everyday plain folk about white privilege, when that is a new term for them. It is difficult for them to grasp. So first, let's start off by asking Dr. Sapp, what is your understanding of white privilege?
So one of the things I want to say, Dr. Davis, because I think you brought up a great point, that, how can we talk to people about something that they're not trying to understand? And I think it comes down to just them not wanting to understand it, or them being in the denial of not wanting to accept that it is so. And so when it comes down to white privilege, and I don't think it's a new term. I think for some people, they want it to be a new term because they've kind of found themselves in a place where, I'm not going to accept that they do have privilege, but I don't think it's a new term. But my understanding of white privilege is plain and simple. If I show up to work with my hair a certain way, or I'm wearing a certain kind of clothes, or certain thing, person who is of Caucasian descent, they're white, they don't look like the same exact things, chances are I'm going to be that person who I'm going to be talked to about why do I have my hair colorful, or things of that nature. So white privilege is individuals who are non-African American of Caucasian descent tend to be able to do things that others are not able to. White privilege is them not having to worry about being stopped by the police, or find themselves in George Floyd's situation where there is a police officer who, instead of caring about the well-being of them, ultimates them. That's white privilege.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, what is your understanding of white privilege as I'm hearing more and more about the terms, all lives matter. For the first time, I'm seeing a group of people who are in the majority trying to be inclusive, which really surprised me. But then there are the ones who sometimes are not very open when we're trying to have conversations about white privilege. So what is your understanding about the term white privilege?
The term white privilege speaks to unearned advantages based in race. And in this country and globally, we have recognized with white supremacy that white people are able to get advantages through institutionalized racism and through their daily experiences, simply because of the color of their skin. And those that are not white do experience consequences and trauma and stress related simply to their the color of their skin and being made attempts to be made to believe that they are less than. So you brought up the term all lives matter, and I think that is one of those microaggressions, gaslighting situations where the power and the experiences of racism, especially for Black people, begin to be minimized and silenced and rendered invisible, as it has been for centuries. And so what saying all lives matter does is, in fact, highlight Black lives don't matter, because if all lives mattered, then Black lives wouldn't be sacrificed to police brutality, and Black people would not have the experiences that they do.
So you're saying that it's just words, that there isn't a great deal of meaning or truth behind it.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So Dr. A, tell us about your thoughts about white privilege, and so to help make sure we all truly understand it, so we can be on the same page, so then we can then talk about, how do we talk about that with people? How do we talk about it, about racism to other people?
I think you started this off by asking about how do you talk about racism or white privilege to people who don't want to hear it. And I kept hearing this T-shirt going through my head. I don't argue with people that Harriet Tubman would have shot. All right. And I think that's an important thing, because sometimes I think particularly younger Black people get caught up in trying, and that's why there's so much pain. It's like, why don't you like me? Why do you hate me? Mm-hmm. And so we get into what is really protest culture. Mm-hmm. Protest culture, if people who thinking about the Harlem Renaissance, most of the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance was protest poetry. I'm an American. Why can't you see how beautiful I am, right? It's protest, and it's speaking to the oppressor, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes that adds to that idea of racial trauma, constantly trying to speak to the person who's putting you down to convince them to be nice, mm-hmm. right? And it gets so tiring. That's why I believe it becomes important for people who are experiencing oppression and trauma to learn to speak to each other and lift each other up, and to be stronger, to resist, rather than trying to convince somebody who won't listen that they should be nice to you. That becomes problematic. A basis of my philosophical thinking comes from critical race theory. And I believe that what is called white privilege is written into the documents of US jurisprudence, right? If we think about the Declaration of Independence, complaints that the colonists had against King George is that he was inciting slave uprisings. One of the complaints that the colonists had against King George is that he was inciting what they call the savage Indian tribes. Attack them. In other words, oh, how terrible it is that these Indians would attack us for taking their land, right? It's written into the Constitution The idea that, particularly, if you're wealthy, if you're white, you have an advantage in the world. And it's so oftentimes, even in trying to unpack constitutional law, particularly when you think about these conservatives who call themselves strict constitutionalists, they're strictly adhering to what people today call white privilege, right?
Okay.
And again, I would say, though, that particularly for people of color to sit up and believe that somehow we can convince people who are already unconvincible becomes tiring. It makes much more sense for us to create systems, talk to each other, lift each other up for the struggle itself, because the struggle is real and it's going to go on for a while. This won't be the last time that we see a Black man, woman, or child killed on television. So we should understand that, right? And people often say about critical race theory that, oh my God, it seems so hopeless and fatalistic. It's just realistic, but understanding that we will win and we will survive.
Gotcha. So I hear you, Dr. A, talking about other individuals who, who are not part of my racial group, holding conversations. It is exhausting, explaining what I see, what I'm experiencing, and then I'm becoming confused about why you aren't understanding what's going on in the world. And then some of us lose this desire to even hold those conversations because it can fatigue you. So Dr. Sapp, help us, some of us who are experiencing some of that fatigue, and wondering and asking ourselves, why do I have to educate these other individuals when many of the problems originate within that particular community and they're negatively affecting us? How do we talk about race and white privilege to some of those individuals?
I think that's a really good question, if I'm being honest with you, Dr. Davis, because what I want to say is just don't have the conversation. Is what I want to say. I mean, that's just being honest. Like, why? And I think we have to get to that place where we, as Black clinicians, and even for our allies, and being able to help our supervisees as well as our clients understand that it isn't our responsibility to make them understand, to even help them understand. I think that that's where a lot of the exhaustion, that's where a lot of the stress and all the other negative things that come along with it comes from, because we as individuals, we want to help them understand it. We want to help them get what it is that we feel. We want them to feel what we feel. And I think we have to understand that some people just are not going to get it. They're not going to experience the pain that we have. They're not going to experience the pain that our clients are having. They're not going to be in that place where we want them to be. And so it's almost kind of like that hamster running in a circle on that wheel. And we have to be able to remove ourselves and help our clients to get to a place where they accept that, I can't change somebody. I can't have a conversation with someone who isn't willing to hear the conversation and make the changes.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Smith, aren't we obligated, as mental health professionals to help people to understand? Aren't we trained to help people understand things about themselves and the world that they live in? So help us to understand some ways we can talk about this sensitive topic, this explosive topic at times about racism and white privilege to other individuals.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Davis. So the answer to your question is yes and no. We as people, as human beings, with our therapist hat not on, are not responsible for creating understanding and for creating an environment of understanding. Victim of something to change a system that they didn't create, to change experiences that they haven't inflicted upon themselves. So absolutely not. But as clinicians, we have to ask ourselves, can we make somebody understand anything? Is that a thing? Can we actually, what do we do? I mean, I don't even know. I've been doing this for 15 years. I don't know what I can do to make somebody understand anything. That being said, I do think that there are clinicians, there are consultants, there are trainers, there are writers, there are people that do this work. There are people that educate. And so, and educate about social justice, about diversity, about inclusion. And that's their profession, that's their expertise. And so as clinicians, where we are creating space to help our clients navigate a world that, yes, includes racism, we can give them resources. We can provide resources. We can be a resource if we have the capacity. If we don't have the capacity, that's okay too. But we can be a part of the conversation. As Dr. Akunyili said earlier, we can use ourselves, we can use our experiences to build connections. And so many of us have been in situations where we've needed to build a connection and have a strong therapeutic rapport with a client who may have even said verbally something that was racist.
Yep.
And outright meant to do it. There are some that do it unaware, and there are some that will outright cause pain through their words. And so we still have obligation, we have an ethical obligation to make sure that care is provided, but that we also acknowledge in that looking inward, is this something that we can do? Is this a client that we can see the good in them, even though this has happened, or even though that we're experiencing this in our daily lives? If we can't, then we go to our supervisors, we go to our peers, we do some self-work, we get our own therapist, and we work that out. But what we are responsible for is making sure we can do the work that is being asked of us by our clients. And if we can't, it is our ethical obligation to make sure they get the care that they need, and then that we get the care and the training that we need to make that to make that happen.
Gotcha. And I agree with all of you guys. It can be a daunting task. It could be exhausting, especially when you get those questions from a number of people, or the topic comes up, a supervisee who sees 20 clients in 1 week, and this topic comes up about 80% of the time, and then the clients are going, I don't get it, I don't understand it, I don't know why they're doing that. Maybe the first time, we have the energy to provide some answers or try to help educate, but when it happens over and over again, it can be daunting. One of the things that I like to do is bring up the whole concept about fairness, and equality, and whether or not they believe that that is something that is important, and whether or not they believe that everyone deserves some equality in our world, or even fairness, or even try to bring up a time where they were treated unfairly. Perhaps it was something intensity, bringing up a term that Dr. A brought up, but nevertheless, everyone has experienced some type of mistreatment. We've all experienced some type of unfair situation in our lives, and many find a way to get through it. But sometimes there are those individuals who just cannot take themselves out of the situation to see it from the angle of another individual. But nevertheless, I do feel energized to discuss the topic, but it does become a little bit challenging for us. So with that, many of those individuals are white colleagues, are white friends, co-workers, neighbors that are out there. There are certainly a number of them that want to be an ally for our cause. And many of these individuals are just as upset and devastated by the most recent events, just as we are. What do we say to those individuals who want to be an ally, who want to be on our side, who want to advocate for us? What do we say to them about what we need from them, or what's the best approach for them? Dr. A, can I start with you on that question? Your mic is mute.
I think allies are important. I think it's important that we, again, there's the personal and the individual, but then there's the community and the social. The problems that we're talking about today are community and social, and they have to be changed beyond the therapeutic room. That's why I think it's important to build alliances. And so for those colleagues and comrades and people who are not Black, for instance, who want to build alliances, I think it becomes important. And I think it becomes important then for them to learn as much as they can and go and build networks into their own communities to challenge the racism, to challenge the ideas that are there. I think, as opposed to, I tell people all the time, I do a lot of workshops, and I do workshops on these questions. My approach to therapy is it's related to narrative therapy, but in the context of African American culture, and I teach about that. And when I do those workshops, I tell people I'm doing these workshops specifically to encourage young Black therapists to do more work with Black people. At the same time, I welcome white people who want to come and learn. I say, come and learn, respecting what I'm talking about as something that might be valuable for your community. In the same way that all my life as a therapist, I have gone to white therapists to learn from them, right? Not to learn how to work better with white people, but to learn how to use those really good ideas and say, how can I make that fit into my community, right? So in the same way, it's not so much about our allies needing to come and help us with Black people, or help us with Latinx people, or help us with Asian people, but that our allies come and maybe learn from us what we're saying, and then take that information back to communities, right? To begin to challenge the ideas that are messing up this society. And then we work together in that way. So allies are extremely important. If we look at it that way.
I like that. That's actually you introduced a new concept to me, as I was thinking the white allies are people who can come and assist us, with the things that we're going through. But what you're suggesting, which is wonderful, to go back to their own community and educate those individuals who are there.
We've been waging this fight for 400 years, right? We've been taking care of ourselves, right? We are not incompetent, which is also what racist ideas would try to teach us, right? That's why it becomes so important for us who are Black therapists and therapists of color to learn to look to our own folk ways and ideas to find ways of even doing therapy, right? One of the things that happens under white privilege and white supremacy is we learn to be totally dependent on the ideas of the people who have colonized us for 400 years, as if no Black people have thought of anything worth thinking about in therapy, right? All of my best teachers are people that come from my cultural experience and my historical experience. Nancy Boyd Franklin, Frantz Fanon, right? These are the places that I look to get ideas about doing therapy, because they have an interest in healing the wounds that have happened to us over time, right? And so we don't need somebody else to come and save us and help us. We need people who are willing to go out and stop the aggressions against us while we take care of ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Ace. So Dr. Sapp, what can you add to that about suggestions to those individuals who want to be wonderful allies to us?
I think one of the things is knowing your why. Why are you wanting to be an ally? It's easy to say I want to purpose in that, then what am I doing as an ally? I think what Dr. A said is perfect, of going back. So knowing your why you're doing it, and going back into your communities and being able to help your community understand why this oppression is so detrimental to people of color, to African Americans, to Hispanics, helping them to understand before they can even tackle their why, doing their own personal work again, taking personal responsibility for themselves, and understanding that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. They're going to get resistance, but that they have to be able to stay the course if they're truly working to be an ally of us or of people of color.
Thank you. I like that, Dr. Sapp. But part of the things that make us successful with what we tend to do in life, is understanding our purpose behind it and the reason why we're seeking that out. And that can certainly help us to reach some of our goals. So I like that a lot. Dr. Smith, what can you help us out with to inform those individuals who want to be an ally to our cause, who are actually, they understand, what we may be going through, and they're just as shocked and horrified like part of our ethnic cultural group? What can you say to them about how they can be useful?
Yeah, the first thing is to deconstruct for yourselves what the term ally is. In this particular case, being an ally is someone that I'd like to be. I'd like to be an ally for white communities who would like to go and talk to their families, to their friends, to challenge the racist ideals in their daily lives. So I would like to sit with you to have those conversations and to support you. Communities of color did not create racism. They did not create the social construction of race. And so therefore, it is not our place or our job to dismantle racism. That being said, we absolutely have an investment in the dismantling of racism, and so therefore, I am willing to stand with my white counterparts to be able to start to have these conversations. We can have conversations amongst ourselves, and then what I'd also like to do is to challenge them to have let's have a Zoom call. Let's have a Zoom call with your parents, with your siblings, with your cousins, with your grandparents. Let's do that because I know that will be a very, very difficult conversation. And so I can be there in support of you and to really help to just navigate that, because I know that that's an emotional process, and I know that there can be some consequences that they may not be prepared for. That being said, it's necessary and it has to happen, and that's what allyship should look
Thank you
like.
so much. You guys have really educated me on the whole concept of allies and the role of those other individuals within our lives. So I'm going to ask a final question, and then we're going to try to open it up to the attendees if they have any questions and about receiving questions from people who are attending the webinar. So finally, what do we say, or how do we explain this mess to our children? I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I'll be honest, I shield her from a lot of this. I didn't know what to tell her about this. You know, I can talk about racism and discrimination in her own terms and words, but this was so horrific out there. But I don't want her to live in this little made-up bubble world, you know, as I need to start preparing her for some realities that are out there. And I admit, I struggled. I don't counsel children. I never received training in it, but I sort of struggled and trying to explain some of this. And by chance, she has her own phone. So we can debate that later about whether or not she should have one. But she found the video of George Floyd and the police officer with his knee on the back of his neck. And so she saw it, and she had an emotional reaction. And I think I handled that fairly well. And she's in a much better place today than that moment. And it opened up a lot of conversations that we're still having with her. But I want to hear from you guys about some of the attendees out there who may have kids, their supervisees may have kids, or their clients. They may be seeing kids. How do we explain this and what's going on to the children that are out there? Let's start with you, Dr. Sapp. And your mic is on mute. Dr. Sapp?
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I like what you said, and I think I'm going to, drawing on my own experience, as I said before, living 2 counties over from Brunswick, where Ahmaud Arbery was killed. I had to have that conversation with my son. My son came, and my son said, I don't get this. And he's 13. And he was like, so what happens to me? And for me, that broke me, because I've got to explain this to my son, who, while he sees it on TV, he hasn't experienced it, and it happened in our backyard almost. And so I think being able to, I think shielding them doesn't help. Then when they are faced with it, it's so much harder, because then it's a burden for them, and they're trying to figure out all these different things in their head. Why does this happen? He looks like me. What if that was me? So I think being able to be compassionate with them, but being honest with them, having that, helping them to understand. going back through history and helping them understand how we've gotten to this place, but also being able to reassure them that while these things are happening, as parents, as clinicians, and I say this for our clinicians talking to our kids, and even talking to clients that we're working with that are children, being able to assure that, you know, there are people there who are there to protect them, that they are loved, that, you know, we can't stop the ways of the world. I think that's one of the hardest things sometimes we as adults and even as parents have to face. We have to realize that we were our kids once, and what would I want? What would I want, or another?
Thank you, Dr. Sapp. I think we caught most of that, what you were saying, but I remember you saying we cannot shield them from everything, cannot allow them to continue living in this little bubble. But Dr. Smith, I'm going to pass this on to you. You know, we can help hold honest conversations with children, whether they're our children or not. But some of that, we're breaking that innocence. We're putting a crack in some of that innocence in the world that they're living in. I know I certainly felt that way when I was talking about it with my daughter. How can we help kids to understand this? It's particularly the Black kids that are out there.
Yeah. So the first thing is, you know, we need to take the pressure off. We can't explain the unexplainable. Racism is not something that I even understand. So therefore I can't necessarily explain it. That being said, I think that there is there's protection in creating pride and making sure that we are instilling in them that, yes, this is how the world sees you, and these are experiences that you are going to be impacted by, and that you're impacted by right now. So making sure that we acknowledge what is going on for them, the confusion, the, you know, just kind of trying to make sense of that and make sense of their place in this world. But I think that there is a way that we can overwhelm them with the lessons of pride and the spaces of pride of Black culture. And so that's as a therapist who makes sure to have books about Black children where they can see themselves in those books, in their toys, in our conversations, and in, you know, saying, and not just you have a pretty shirt on, but your skin is beautiful, and your hair is lovely, and you know, just making sure that we speak light into them, so that when they are experiencing this world now and in the future, that they have a protection, that they have an armor, that no matter what others say of them, that the belief system about themselves will overpower that I don't care what you have to say about me. I don't care about what you know, you think about me. That is our experience, and that's something that I have to feel. But I can also take inventory, and I can also say to myself, you're wrong, because I'm excellent in these.
I like that. So using affirmations to help build up this strong sense of self that will eventually help prepare them to deal with some of these unfortunate incidents that are out there in the world. I like that a lot. Dr. A. Oh, I'm sorry.
I learned that from my mom. Hi, Mom.
She did a great job. So Dr. A, how do you explain this to the kids who are out there? How do you explain all of this?
I think what's important, I was thinking, I was very fortunate. As I said, I was born in Mississippi and grew up in California later, but I was always surrounded as a child by very positive Black institutions, right? When I was little, like my family is a part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and even in Mississippi. So one of the first images of Jesus that I saw was my father playing Jesus in a passion play, right? So I saw a Black Jesus.
All right.
Right. My parents were civil rights organizers in Mississippi, and so I was involved in meetings and things like that in Mississippi. I even went to jail at about 8 years old because I got caught up in a SNCC student demonstration. Right. The students were babysitting me and they took me off. And I that's kind of the environment that I grew up in. But also for my children, you know, again, this is not a new crisis. When my son was 10 years old, one of the last memories he has of leaving California to come to Georgia was being on the street during the Rodney King uprisings, right? But how, so I have grandchildren now, 4 boys and a granddaughter, but to surround them with very natural parts of our culture. So which means that there's got to be conversations about this, whether it's, I think Dr. Smith talked about, what are the images that we show our children? Do they see pictures of themselves, images of themselves, history about themselves, so that, all of my children and grandchildren have heard stories and seen stories about not so much just focusing on Black oppression and pressure, but Black resistance and accomplishment.
Gotcha.
Right? Which always includes resistance against oppression. But those things are important. Having those natural conversations. I can talk to my 12-year-old grandson for his birthday when he turned 12. I gave him a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I gave him Black Panther illustrated novel, right? So he said, we're going to talk about that. And when you read that, we'll talk about that. And the things that I get from my grandchildren and the pictures that they see when they're in their homes, when they're in my home, right? So that it becomes a natural part of the culture. So these negative intrusions aren't some surprises all of a sudden, as if, well, we've never talked about the fact that you're Black.
Yeah.
Right? I think that becomes really important for our children. And these things do come up, right? I try, like you, I don't do a whole lot of therapy with children. I've got a couple of clients that are teenagers, but even with Black teenagers, these things come up because oftentimes when I do get teenagers, they're parents who've put their children in mostly white schools, right? And so they're the only Black kid in the school, Black kid in the class. And that question comes up, right? What that experience is like for them, right? So we have to be able and ready to have those conversations with children. But I think what this conversation that we've had all this time says, if we haven't unpacked it for ourselves, it's hard to have those conversations with children.
Absolutely.
Right? We have to unpack the meaning of it for ourselves and also feel comfortable in our own skin that it's okay to be Black, right?
Absolutely.
This is not our fault that this is happening, right? And feel comfortable with that so we can have those conversations with children.
Gotcha. I like that idea, starting early, educating the kids about who they are, where they come from, and including in that other people who are out there and the diversity of the world and the good that can come with that, and some things that are not so good that can come with that. But it can be a challenge to have with the kids. Coincidentally, my daughter came to me yesterday. She wants to go out and protest. So she's at home now making signs, Black Lives Matter, and she wants to go out there and protest. So the next challenge is figuring out where am I going to take her so that we can do it safely. But I'm glad to see that she's in a place where she feels comfortable advocating for herself and other Black people. So we're down to the last 6 minutes. You guys have done a wonderful job answering some of the questions. And I wanted to see if we can just take a couple of questions from the audience, and I just open it up. And Rachel, can you help me with that?
Sure, yeah. Such great discussion over here in chat, as well as 67 questions that have come in the Q&A. I don't know if you guys can see those Q&A questions. I'm happy to pull a couple of them out, or if you want to look.
Can you do that? Try to find something that we haven't touched on.
Yes, I sure can. Let me just ask a couple of questions to you guys that have come up as well. Many people want to tag you guys on social media, take a picture of the screenshot today to share it. They're asking for permission for that first. And maybe also if you want to add your social media tag to the chat, I think that would be helpful for people.
Sure. I've noticed my phone is going off at the same time my screen is going off, and I've had a couple of tags coming in. So I'm perfectly fine with being tagged on any social media forum. On Facebook, I am Dr. Carla L. Sapp /You Matter Counseling. On social media, on Instagram, I am at Dr. K_Sapp, and I'm perfectly fine.
Dr. Smith, how about you?
I'm Mukunda Akunyili on Facebook, and Makungu Akinyela, and at Dr. Mukunda on, I think, both Twitter and Instagram.
And I am at Dr. Carla Smith. I'm mainly on Instagram. I love Instagram, by the way.
And I'm old school. I just joined Twitter recently, and I don't have an Instagram account yet. But on Twitter, I think my handle is Harrison328, and I do a podcast, Two Therapists and a Microphone. And so we have a Facebook page for that we tend to be very active on. So you can certainly join me on those platforms.
I think the one question that maybe I'd love to ask, there's been many resources that have been shared in the chat, and I've been copying and pasting them, and we'll send a list of all of the resources that have been shared by attendees. But I would love to hear from you guys. I'm sure the attendees would as well. What are some top 3 resources that you would suggest for people who want to learn more about this?
I don't know about the top 3. I did write down a few. I think a general Google search is always a great place to start. There is an institution at Boston College called the Institution for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture that's led by Dr. Janet Helms, who is also a scholar in the area of race and racial trauma. There are multiple books that I don't want to even start listing. However, in the chat, I did see that there were several of them named, there are also various trainers that do training specifically for white allyship in the fight against racism. I should have written down the name, and the names are leaving me. However, I'm happy to answer DMs that come in there. I don't know if I just opened up a can of.
Yeah, I was I mentioned earlier one of my most important mentors, Nancy Boyd Franklin. The first edition of her book, Black Families in Therapy, is where I was able to find a mentor even when I didn't have a live one. And then I met Nancy at an AAMFT convention, and I was so surprised. I went up and introduced myself, and she says, "Oh, I know you." She'd read one of my articles. I felt so blessed, right? But the second edition of that, Black Families in Therapy by Nancy Boyd Franklin, I think a lot of the things that we've even talked about today, she touches on. I have a good friend, Kenneth Hardy, who I always joke, Kenneth Hardy is like Martin Luther King to my Malcolm X. He has a much softer approach to dealing with these issues, but he and Monica McGoldrick edited the last edition of Revisioning Family Therapy, and there's articles by scores of different therapists, including many therapists of color, dealing with these issues. I think I've got an article in that particular edition of the book on working with Black couples coming in for the first time, for instance. And I think also Ken Hardy has a couple of works on doing supervision with cultural sensitivity. So I think those are some things that people might want to look at as well.
An organization that I can encourage is called Color of Change. It's a nonprofit civil rights advocacy organization that tries to promote policy designed to bring on more equality. Color of Change is a good one.
And I just add a couple of organizations. Through ACA, we have the Counselors of Social Justice, have the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, and they are offering a lot of things right now just as well. So Counselors of Social Justice and Association of Cultural Counseling and Development.
Great resources. You guys, this was such incredible information. I think there's a call for some of you guys to become president in the chat. Truly, people are so appreciative of this information. I'm going to send out the full chat transcript so everybody can see anything they missed, as well as the list of resources. Also, I mentioned earlier about the peer group. So Dr. Smith, Dr. Sapp, and Dr. Akunyili are all going to lead peer groups on this very issue. in an ongoing manner. So if you want to be a part of that, please let us know. We'd love that. And then all of these are available for one-to-one consultation as well. I will add the Twitter handles, the LinkedIn information, all of that for each of the panelists so that you guys can continue the conversation with them. But this has been such a fruitful discussion. I have learned so much. I'm going to watch it like 5 more times to just make sure I got everything. But thank you so much. I can't say it enough to Dr. Smith, Dr. Davis, Dr. Akunyili, and Dr. Sapp for your time, your wisdom, your guidance. It's been invaluable. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.